Welcome back to The Young Idealist in my ongoing series on classical German philosophy and post-Kantian thought. And today I have a very special guest. I have Sebastian Luft, who is a professor of theoretical philosophy at the University of Paderborn in Germany. And before Paderborn, he was teaching at the University of Marquette from 2004 to 2023. Professor Luft's research interests are metaphysics, epistemology, history of Western philosophy, phenomenology and consciousness, 19th century German philosophy, including Husserl and Cassirer. He is the editorial assistant and lecturer at Katholieke Universiteit Leuven, Belgium, Husserl Archives from 1998 to 2002, a research fellow and lecturer at the State University of New York and Stony Brook, from 96 to 1997, and a research fellow at the Bergische Universität at Wuppertal in Germany from 1994 to 1998. His areas of specialization are European philosophy, transcendental philosophy, phenomenology and hermeneutics, philosophy of culture, epistemology, pragmatism, Kant and German idealism, Neo-Kantianism, phenomenology, American pragmatism, and I'm extremely happy to have you here today, Dr. Luft, and thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Chris. Glad to be here.
We are here to talk about Ernst Cassirer, and I saw a lot of your research and your work, including academic papers, edited volumes on Cassirer, so you seem like such a perfect candidate for me to have here. So I was wondering if we could just start off by asking, who was Ernst Cassirer and why do you think his thought matters today?
Thanks, Chris, once again for having me. I'll be happy to answer your questions. Who was Cassirer? He was a well-to-do German of Jewish descent. I say this because, as so many people in his generation, being Jewish didn't matter to him at all. He was very secular, liberal, democratic, Democrat, so to speak, much like Husserl and Freud. So being Jewish didn't really matter to them. It did matter once the Nazis came to power, and of course, then being a Jew was a reason to be excluded from the German population, and so he had to flee. But he came from a well-to-do background. His family, Cassirer, the Cassirer family, you can find them on the internet. There's a family tree somewhere. Many people, Cassirer probably being the most famous, but art dealers, publishers. So he came from a very well-to-do intellectual family. His wife, Toni, who happened to be his cousin, met several of the other cousins and siblings and relatives of Cassirer and concluded that he was the smartest of them all. So she decided to, marry him. And so she reports that, again, his family must have been a very mundane, rich family spread out all over Europe, including England and later the United States. So he was so well to do that he didn't really need to make a career. So he was just somebody who just loved studying and doing intellectual work. He studied all kinds of disciplines. Finally, he happened upon philosophy. At one point in his life, he lived in Berlin and he studied or took classes from the philosopher called Georg Simmel. And Simmel, so the anecdote goes, he lectured on Kant, and Cassirer had never heard of Kant, was fascinated by Kant. Simmel, of course, if you know him, has a very idiosyncratic view of philosophy. Cassirer went to him and said, I'd like to know more about Kant. Where can I know more? And Simmel said, well, the best books on Kant are written by Hermann Cohen in Marburg. I don't understand any of them, but they're clearly the best. So that, of course, gave Cassirer the incentive to go to the very small university town Marburg, which is probably as big as Paderborn here. So a very small university town, which was a big thing for someone like Cassirer, who was used to living in Berlin, Vienna, Paris. So he never really lived much in Marburg, but he went there, introduced himself to Hermann Cohen, and then, of course, Cohen took him under his wing. So who was Cohen? Cohen was, together with Paul Natorp, the spearhead of the so-called Marburg School of Philosophy, or Marburg, more precisely, School of Neo-Kantianism. And the Neo-Kantians were obviously philosophers in the Kantian vein who decided they would have to go back to Kant after the so-called excesses of Hegelianism in the 19th century and facing a new situation, especially with the natural sciences having such a big ascent. And so, if you think only of the problem of the a priori, that didn't seem to be the way Kant made it out to be. So, just one term here to be named, the historical a priori. And so, the idea was that so many things that Kant said could only be reconciled with a modern scientific situation if you update him. So, Kant 2.0, as it were. And that was the idea of the Marburg School. So, there were several schools of Neo-Kantianism in the German-speaking lands at the time, a little bit also in France and England, but mainly in the German-speaking lands, Germany, Austria, Switzerland. Not really being fond of Marburg as a city, he nevertheless became a member of the Marburg School and started publishing in this vein. So, especially his early works were works in the history of ideas, Problemgeschichte, history of problems, that, of course, had their systematic angle from the Neo-Kantian position. He then emancipated himself very quickly, you could say, from his heirs, from his teachers, Cohen and Natorp, and founded or crafted, you could say, a philosophy of culture that was Kantian in name, and more than just in name, but very liberal compared to his teachers. And to make a long story short, I guess we'll talk more about his philosophy later. He became professor of philosophy late in his life, fairly late, because he, as I say, financially wasn't very needy, so he never really tried hard. But by the time World War I was over and the new University of Hamburg was founded, he was, so to speak, one of on top of everybody's list. And he became professor in Hamburg, where he lived for more than a decade and made a nice career of himself, and also became, I never found out it was the first, but certainly was not an unusual thing for a Jew to become the president of the university, which he became in 1930-31 for 1 year. 1933 comes around. He, as a Jew, of course, immediately faces discrimination, and he was one of the very few Jews, he and his wife and the whole family, who decided right away they would have to leave Germany. So he spends the summer vacation 1933 in Switzerland. He and his wife read the newspapers and follow the political developments and decide they will never return. So they do return to Germany, of course, to sell their house, but immediately flee to England and then later elsewhere. That's a very touching story that he and also others like Husserl received many invitations from universities abroad, in the United States, UK, and elsewhere to come study and be basically a scholar in residence. Husserl, as you might know, received a call to University of Southern California in Los Angeles, declined because he was too old. Cassirer, of course, was a bit younger, and so he received a visiting appointment first in Oxford, in England, where he and his wife and family moved to. Then his contract expired, and he got another offer to go to Sweden. Sweden became seized by the Nazis, and so he then again had to flee. At that point, he receives an invitation to go to Yale University for 2 years. So he flees at that point, flees to the United States. And at Yale, he has a fair amount of success, has some students who are very interested in his philosophy. Of course, he's still learning English. His English wasn't perfect, it never was. So he gives classes on especially Kant and Hegel, publishes some pieces that were written in English or written in English and, of course, then edited by Hempel and others, where he basically introduces his philosophy to the English-speaking audience. Essay on Man and Myth of the State, those two big books at the end. Yale runs out again, the contract runs out, and he has yet another visiting appointment at Columbia University. So he and his wife and children relocate from New Haven to New York, to Manhattan. And it is there that Cassirer has a massive heart attack shortly before the war ends. He was also very worried about the war efforts and everything. So shortly before the war ends, he has a massive heart attack in New York City and dies there in 1945, before the war is even over. Why does this thought matter today? Yeah, well, because I think he is somebody who comes from the continental tradition, clearly. So Kant and the Neo-Kantians. He also, of course, read phenomenology, Frankfurt School, everything. He's somebody who had a encyclopedic knowledge. He forged a philosophy of culture that I think has many interesting ramifications for not only philosophy but also interdisciplinary research. To put it sort of in one sentence, you cannot do philosophy in the armchair. That you always have to be in touch with disciplines that work with cultural phenomena. So if you want to talk about language, which is a symbolic form, as you know, you have to read linguists and see what they say about language. If you want to talk about culture, you have to talk to ethnologists, anthropologists. And so he's always in conversation with these cultural scientists, you would say today, to talk about culture. And so his philosophical reflections on culture are philosophical, but they're always informed by culture itself. So you have to immerse yourself in culture and also in the scholarship on culture that basically then creates one big continuity between life, science, or sciences or scholarly disciplines that talk about regions of life, and the philosophical reflection upon all of it.
I mean, what a rich life to have. He sounds like he's extremely well read, very articulate, very inquisitive. So thank you so much for that lovely, rich answer. If you had to discuss his main philosophical influences, and you can also add in any other influences that you think that are important in either cultural studies or anthropology, who do you think are his main influences that help shape or broaden this work of his?
So at first place, of course, is always Kant. I mean, the touchstone is Kant. He was and remained a Neo-Kantian to the end of his life. Of course, in a qualified sense of Kant. So we'd have to talk more about that. But in terms of a name, certainly Kant. He wrote many scholarly treatises on many different figures. I'll just mention the name Descartes, Leibniz, Rousseau, Hegel, Kant, von Humboldt. So those were names that people that he conversed with. So they all had an influence, but certainly the second most important person that had an influence on him was Goethe, the poet, philosopher, scientist Goethe. Nowadays, even in Germany, is known. If you ask young people, they hardly know the name anymore, and if they were to cough up something, they would say Faust, the famous tragedy. But Goethe was also known as he was a natural scientist in his day, not in the sense of the experimental sciences like Newton. So there was a quarrel that he had between him and the Newtonians, which is a different story. So he did do research into nature, and he also wrote on the theory of colors. So there's a philosophical aspect to Goethe that is hardly known anymore today, which is what Cassirer found interesting. So especially the concept of the symbol, the primal phenomena to which we have access. Those were some of the ideas that come up in Goethe's Reflections and Maxims, which is a collection of aphorisms that he found especially interesting. Kant, Goethe, certainly all the classics altogether. So he also appreciated very much Schiller. Was in touch with many scientists of his day, right? So he of course was known as a philosopher among philosophers. So he had correspondence and contacts with people like Heidegger. I guess we'll talk about that later, which was initially at least very respectful. He was always very respectful of everybody. But another person who was, of course, also important for him was Abi Warburg. Warburg was a very quixotic, quirky intellectual. Warburg, the family owned a bank, so they were very, very wealthy. And Abi was one of the sons of the family business, basically, who suffered mental issues all his life. So he never really held down a job. But what he did do was establish the Warburg Library. It was basically his villa where he had basically books all over. The idea of the library was that it was all about cultural sciences. And so the arrangement of the library was that it went from myth, which is the lowest cultural rung, to Cassirer as well, to higher cultural forms. So Warburg, being Jewish as well, his library had to relocate to London. So you can go to London and see the Warburg Library and spend basically a whole day there. So it was basically reconstructed there. But Cassirer when he was professor at Hamburg, he got to know Warburg and his circles. Warburg had a whole circle of intellectuals and artists, very artistic scene. And he came to the library and walked around, and Warburg explained to him how he arranged the books. And Cassirer then said, "Oh, this is exactly my philosophy, basically in the form of a library." So he became a very close friend of Warburg and his circle in his time in Hamburg, where he also, studied, used books, gave lectures. And so Warburg sort of stands for the connection to the sciences, to the science and to the cultural scene of Weimar Germany, of course, which is a time we no longer have, but being in touch with the artistic, artsy-fartsy scene, you could say, in a city like urban city like Hamburg, where he was able to talk to many intellectuals who would come to these talks at Warburg's house and sort of meet the broader intellectual audience of a city like Hamburg. So those would be I would say the most important figures that had influence on him.
So he's near an absolute constellation of philosophers, thinkers,
Yes,
artists, anthropologists, everything. He's just pulling together.
that's
What a
right.
what a brilliant thinker.
Yeah,
This seems
yeah.
very, it seems like in the same tradition that, Schelling and Hegel and many others were
That's
taking.
right. He was called one of the last universal Universalgelehrte, universal scholars, because he really was someone who brought together so many different. I mean, he was well versed in natural sciences, mathematics, languages, linguistics, cultural studies, philosophy, of course, as well as different disciplines. He talked about technology later in his life. So it's really amazing that he not wouldn't just like talk about these things like spitting out ideas that a philosopher might spin out, but also always very, very well informed by scholars of the cultural regions he was discussing. So it's quite amazing and impressive in a way that I don't think people today could pull together all these things into one philosophical system anymore. Of course, we're now much more differentiated and spread out in terms of what we can know, and we have the internet and all that. But nonetheless, I mean, what he was able to do was most impressive.
Yeah, I've read his work on the Enlightenment, which was extremely rich, but I think his text on Cusanus and
Mhm.
the Renaissance is one of my favorite texts I've ever read. He has such a unique way of expressing really difficult concepts and making them,
Yeah.
disclosing them very nicely. And that text itself has had a profound impact on me. So what you're saying and what you're explicating is I can see this individual right before me. What is Cassir's relationship to Neo-Kantianism? Now, you did bring up Natorp and the
Mhm.
Marburg School. Does he stay committed to this school of thought of Neo-Kantianism and Kant, or does he break away from it?
So this question's answer depends on who you ask, right? So I give you my opinion, or at least my take, but I can also sort of put it in a broader perspective. So, of course, he was a student of Natorp's and Cohen, so that, of course, makes him, by definition, a member of the Marburg School, and also counter that being career-wise one of the most successful ones. So, of course, he was of course identified with that movement. Um, the first wave of Cassirer scholarship in the 90s, you say, I mean, after the Renaissance of Cassirer scholarship, the first wave sort of had him moving out of the Neo-Kantian camp. That the reading then was something like, well, that his philosophy of culture has really nothing to do with Kant anymore, and the Neo-Kantians, and he's really moving on to something else. And I think I mean, he is moving on to something else, but that's too easy. But my reading is more like this. He is always a Kantian in the sense that he is committed to transcendental idealism. And the idea here being is that we're never in touch with the world as it is in itself. We're always only in touch with it, mediated through our capacities of not just cognition, but experience in the broader sense. So that's again immediately a contact with Kant and a difference. So he thought that Kant was right in claiming that our cognition of the world depends on the categories of our thinking, so that we are never in touch with the world as it is, but always with the world. Of course, we're in touch with the world, but we cognize it in the way that we have concepts and categories and forms of experience, space and time that mediate basically the way we experience the world. If that's a basic statement of transcendental idealism, Cassirer would say absolutely, but cognition is far too narrow to capture our being in touch with the world, right? So we're in touch with the world through many different manners of experience, you could say. Artistic experience is one of them. Religious experience is one of them. Mythical experience is one of them. Scientific experience is one of them as well, but not the only one. So the idea that that our relation to the world is always mediated by our forms of experience is taken to be true, but Cassirer says it has to be pluralized. So we have to have a plural sense of ways in which we're in touch with the world. Cognition is one of them, not the only one, maybe the best, the highest in terms of our cognitive achievements, if we think of just the brain power we put into scientific thinking. But there's also language, the way we speak puts us in touch with the world, puts us in touch with other human beings as well, of course, right? So through cognition, we are able to communicate, but also through language. The same goes for art and myth, and there are other forms. So that's the basic statement of transcendental idealism. Agreed with Kant, but pluralized. So that immediately marks the connection to Kant and as well as the difference. Now, with the Neo-Kantians, they already had the idea. So, I mean, I'm talking about the Marburg School here the whole time. The phrase Cassirer uses, the critique of reason has to become the critique of culture. So someone like Cohen could have already said the same thing, that we need to broaden a philosophy that is focused on cognition to a philosophy that's focused on culture as a whole. But Cohen and Natorp were still very much beholden to the Kantian triad of cognition, moral action, beauty, as well as, of course, religion, which is not part of the critiques, but part of the Kantian system. So they very much focused their plurality on the Kantian distinctions of, thinking, doing, feeling, as it were. And that Cassirer thought was too narrow, right? So he also broadened himself. He also relaxed, as it were, his gaze when it came to culture towards culture in its full plurality and richness, as it were, which you cannot always account for through something like a categorical system, like in Kant's table of the categories. The Kantianism in Cassirer, to put it simple, is transcendental idealism. We are never in touch with the world as it is, but only in the way our mental capacities, in the broadest sense of the term, allow us to take the world in. And the distance from Kant and the Neo-Kant is that this has to be taken in the broadest sense of the term, such that cultural forms such as language could be part of a transcendental investigation, as it were. I mean, Humboldt already had this idea, criticizing Kant for basically neglecting language, but also myth, right? So mythical consciousness as the bedrock of culture, as it were, also it's not primitive in the sense of simple. It has its own form of complexity, but that is very different from the way we think in scientific thinking or in, for example, religious practice, although, of course, religious practice is also very closely tied to mythical thinking, right? So those are ways of accounting for our encounter with the world that you could not accommodate in a Kantian framework. But the basic idea that we only see light basically refracted through a prism. That was a metaphor of Goethe's that Cassirer was fond of, that we only see the light refracted through a prism, and the different colors are basically the different symbolic forms.
Fantastic. I was just gonna a follow-up, really fast follow-up question. You talked about this idea of extending reason forward into culture, but then you brought up these ideas of mythic consciousness, but also language. So this
Mhm.
is what he means by going just beyond cognition, going into mythic
Right.
consciousness, going into language. this is what you meant by your
That's
comment.
right. Yes. So, for example, I mean, you could say, if we just take the form of intuition in Kant, space and time, right? Yes, it's absolutely true that our experience of the world is, in terms of our intuition of the world, is in the forms of space and time. But space and time are very different when experienced, for example, in mythical consciousness. In myth, you have the sense that time might be extended, or that time might be founded by the Godhead or something like that. So, or that space is experienced as something that is more than just the three-dimensional Euclidean space, but a space in which human beings, for example, feel threatened by the forces of nature, for example, right? So that's the example where Cassirer would say, yes, there are forms of intuition, and in Kant, when he says space and time, that's very true, very broadly speaking, true, right? In a very broad sense. But space and time, when it is experienced, or just take something like music, right? If you experience the way you experience time in music, extended, or you forget time, even you lose time when you listen to music, right? So that's time right there, experienced in the form of, for example, the symbolic form of art. So that's the example for where you say Kant was right, but in a very broad and basic sense. But if we look at the experience of time and space in different cultural forms, we have to give very different accounts of space and time.
Now, I want to thank you very much for your answer. It's extremely rich and also very, very helpful for me because I'm just getting into Cassirer's work and I'm already fascinated by this thinker and by his philosophical oeuvre. I really, really dislike bringing up another thinker, but anytime you think of Cassirer, people always ask me, Make sure you bring up the Davos debate." And so this really wasn't my own question. This is a question that I was asked by multiple people on my channel to make sure I asked this question. Do you think Cassirer made any headway against Heidegger at the Davos debate? Every time I speak to anyone about this, it's always, oh, Heidegger had the upper hand. It's not about who won, but
Yeah. Well,
what was the main focus of this debate?
okay, Davos is a big topic again of its own. As you know, Michael Friedman became famous, among other reasons, the great Michael Friedman, by claiming that this Davos event was the greatest philosophical event in the 20th century, if there are such things as philosophical events, even, right? And so the idea that a debate is an event and that there would be winners or losers is a bit of a strange notion, as it were. But of course, it had historical significance in the sense that, we're talking about 1929, 4 years before the Nazis seized power in Germany. And 4 years later, one of them becomes the president of a university and wants to lead the leader, Führer, führen, as Heidegger calls it. And the other one is forced to leave Germany, or at least thinks he has to leave, which probably was a very good idea in hindsight. Of course, has historical significance. So the event itself at the time was very much heated up already. The mood was very heated up. There was a little skirmish before. There was some anti-Semitic rants against Cohen in newspapers at the time, to which people like Cassirer wanted to react publicly to not let things like the standoff between two, big shot philosophers. One being more or less a representative of the old school. That's how Cassirer was perceived. Cassirer, Heidegger, on the other hand, being perceived as the young generation. He came dashing in with his ski suit, ski overalls, and went skiing, whereas other people stayed indoors and were doing philosophical debates. Add to that Cassirer himself contracted the virus. So during this whole week, he, for the most time, spent in bed, just recuperating. It wasn't there. And so for the final showdown, then at the event for the final debate, then he basically got out of bed and and tried to put on a good show. And so you can imagine how the young people would perceive this one guy as an older man who's not doing well, and Heidegger being suntan, being sportive, coming from the ski slopes, full of energy. How that would, of course, be a matter of a perception that you can imagine. Um, The debate itself, I think, is certainly hyped or overrated. For the longest time, there was only a transcript available written by or taken down by one of the students of Heidegger's, so it was always slanted, right? So he clearly wrote down more for what Heidegger said than what Cassirer said. But they more or less, I mean, there are also reports that it was rather cordial, that they shook hands afterwards, that they were, polite to each other. Of course, polite can mean different things. I mean, Heidegger was never very polite. Cassirer was always very gracious to people. Probably both didn't like each other too much, but respected each other certainly. So back to the debate itself. I mean, if you read it, it's a very short text. Every sentence has been dissected by scholars by now. I mean, the official topic was their interpretation of Kant. So they were talking about Kant a great deal and Neo-Kantianism, but for the most part, they just sort of exchange familiar positions. And in the end, I think it was Heidegger who says something like, well, at least we can agree to disagree and we don't always have to agree. And, he says to the students here, look, this is how philosophers debate. We don't always come to a conclusion or to a synthesis, but we come here. So upper hand in the sense that, I mean, Heidegger was perceived as the younger, more energetic philosopher who was also much better, one has to admit, at presenting himself and his ideas in public form like that. Cassirer, of course, being rather staid, perhaps not fully recuperated from his illness, right? We don't know. Who basically repeated the old things. And add to that Heidegger was an existentialist, right? He was talking about human beings' concrete existence and authentic existence. And of course, to young people to this day, if you teach a class on existentialism, Chris, you know this, that people are much more taken by these concrete ideas about the personal individual and oneself than talk about culture as a whole. Now, to put this philosophical point on this, I mean, that of course has a significance insofar as for Cassirer, the individual really doesn't count for much, right? At one point, Heidegger says in the debate, what I call Dasein, Cassirer, there is no term in your philosophy for what I mean by Dasein. And Cassirer essentially agrees, and it's true, right? So for Cassirer, the idea is really that we become a human being by immersing ourselves in culture, right? By being part of the projects of culture, you could say, that make us who we are. And if we do that, it also takes away the dread of finitude, right? So, I mean, that what Heidegger wallows in finitude, right? And how finitude informs everything that we do. And Cassirer would say, sure, fair enough. But what's much more important, how we wrest ourselves from this finitude by partaking and contributing to culture as a social intersubjective project. And that's what makes us more significant. And if you do that, if you become part of a cultural event or a party, political party or whatever, then your personality doesn't count. What counts is how you can contribute, how you put your energy to use for a social project. I mean, I'm using language that Cassirer wouldn't use. And of course, that was the philosophical stance of Cassirer, is that the individual counts only in as much as he or she becomes part of culture. And of course, culture in that sense was exactly what Heidegger railed against in Being and Time, when he talked about the big cities and the inauthentic existence. And so that was basically the standoff between them. And Heidegger was perceived at the time as having won the day because of his own presentation, performance, but also because of his focus on the individual. And again, remember that we're talking about 1929, world crisis, in Weimar Republican crisis, people already after World War One having doubts about culture as a whole, civilization. So in that sense, to the zeitgeist, Heidegger spoke much more acutely than Cassirer probably ever wanted to.
Could you explain what Cassirer was trying to accomplish with his philosophy of symbolic forms, and what do you think are some of the main concepts in it?
Well, I mean, first of all, it is a masterpiece. I think it is one of the most important works of the 20th century in philosophy, for sure. Ranks up there with Being in Time and Logical Investigations. And his erudition was somebody who had a hard time reining himself in. So what makes it frustrating to read him for me, but also if you read him with students, is that his books are always learned in the sense that he's not somebody who puts his theses out there, says, here's what I think and here's why, but he always couches his what he claims in debates with scholars who talk about the same thing. So he'll say something, okay, language might be viewed as expressing inner life. Well, look, Humboldt already said this, and then we get 3 pages of a reiteration, a paraphrase of Humboldt's thought. Well, that's great, right? But then you finally come around to what Cassirer again wants to claim, and then it becomes very hard to read because he's always in, this is of course a performative act. He wants to show how what he's saying is not just made up in the armchair, but he comes out of a debate with scholars about language or whatever, what have you. So that's what, of course, and if you look at the Philosophy of Symbolic Forms, 3 volumes, it's more than 1,000 pages. It's a massive book. It was also a fragment, so there were parts that he never was able to publish that were now published in the Nachlass edition, which show that he was still sort of wrestling with more ideas. And so it's a huge whale of a piece of scholarship. So that's makes it hard to read. But what were the basic idea? I mean, so why is it significant? Well, I mean, again, to say, Kant thought by the time he had finished his philosophy, all basic questions were basically answered, right? And then that's what he says when he publishes the first edition of the Critique in 1781. And of course, by the time he finishes the third critique, he knows that that's not true, right? Kant himself knows that he's not going to finish what he accomplished, nor is it ever going to be finished. And so in that sense, that's sort of a parallel to Cassirer in the sense that he had the basic idea that, well, the basic symbolic forms, the basic ways in which we experience the world or in touch with the world are myth, language, cognition. And he devotes the 3 volumes to these 3 symbolic forms. But then, and that's a big debate in scholarly debates, he then mentions in other texts and other articles that he writes on the side, before and after, he mentions other symbolic forms such as jurisprudence or law. Technology, he mentions economy. And then at that point, you become confused. You say, wait a minute, so is this an open list? I mean, is this the laundry list of cultural behaviors, or what is it? And it's not clear, but it seems, I mean, again, if you take Cassirer's reading of Kant, where Cassirer says Kant's thought was evolving as he was writing the critique, I think the same goes for Cassirer. Cassirer thought, okay, I'm going to write this basic foundation of a philosophy of culture, which includes these 3 symbolic forms. By the time he's finished, he realizes, wait, that's not all. That there's more cultural forms to which we create, right? It's not something we find; it's something that we create. And perhaps also because of the time that something like technology was vastly evolving during his time, that he said, wait a minute, there's also technology. Is that a symbolic form? And then he writes a few texts on technology where it's like, oh, it seems like this could also be construed as a symbolic form. He at one point mentions humor as a symbolic form. And I put a doctoral student of mine back at Marquette onto this, and she wrote a wonderful dissertation about humor as a symbolic form, Jennifer Mera. And so it seems like this is an open system that is able to accommodate new cultural forms as they arise, right? I mean, if you think of something like the internet or social media, you might say, well, this, in one sense, it is communication. In another sense, it's really a new form of interaction that would merit its own type of investigation. And so it seems that it's an open system, or I want to read it as an open system that's also sensitive to new cultural developments, and also perhaps to developments or to seeing how certain forms no longer seem relevant to us in the way they did maybe 150 years ago. Take only religion, the role of religion in today's world, unless you want to say it lives on in different manifestations. We have to be, as philosophers, open to new cultural forms, new developments within cultural forms. I mean, just take only something like music or art. Pictorial art has vastly evolved in the last 100 years. Music, take only music, right? And so this type of development should be something to which the philosopher should be sensitive, instead of just having certain lofty ideas and projecting them upon culture, but rather to be part of the cultural exchange of the cultural life, and that philosophers are not in any special role of laying foundations or giving final syntheses, but being able to reflect on at a certain level of sophistication and reflection, to reflect upon culture in a way that people working in the trenches of culture might not be able to do, but that philosophers can't give directions of what philosophy or what culture ought to be because philosophers have no such power. And of course, Cassirer witnessed this, and of course, in this last period of his life, that he said, "Well, we have fascism on the horizon again, and this is not something that people could have ever imagined."
Thank you so much for your really, really amazing job of navigating us through this very rich thinker, their life, and their philosophical work and influences. And I can't thank you enough for being here. And just one last thing, is there anything that you're currently working on right now that you'd like to share with everybody else?
Well, I came back to Germany in 2023 to assume the professorship here in Paderborn. And being a professor in Germany just means a lot more responsibilities than you ever have in the US. I don't know about Canada, I imagine the same. So I'm very busy with administrative work, which of course is gratifying because I get to deal with many new issues and deal with young people. So the actual philosophical work has been a bit in the back burner. Nonetheless, in the free time that I do have, I try to now work on American pragmatism. I'm very fascinated by, believe it or not, Richard Rorty. And actually, the reason I am is not because I like his relativism and so on. In postmodern, I don't like that much at all, but because I really think there are important ramifications and affiliation between a philosophy of culture in the Cassirerian sense and what Rorty is doing in his work on pragmatism or neo-pragmatism, whatever you want to call it. So his accounts on culture and the way we communicate in culture, that we give each other's narratives and should be open to other narratives. I mean, that would be sort of a rundown of Rorty, which I can't do now. I think is very much underappreciated. So I think there's lots of relations. So I'm not interested in pragmatism per se, but actually interested in the commonalities between, to put it bluntly, Neo-Kantianism in Europe, phenomenology also in Europe, and the American versions thereof, you can say, which is American pragmatism. So, of course, they're not the same. They have different traditions and backgrounds, but I think they're ultimately working on something similar, which I would call ultimately a philosophy of the Enlightenment, which comes out also in Rorty's last work that was published in 2023. And so that's sort of what I'm trying to do now. I'm not claiming that I could achieve a grand synthesis. I can't do that. But I think it's worth sort of, rather than pointing out the differences, I think focusing on the commonalities between these efforts in modernity, which sort of share commitment to democratic liberal ideas, equality, enlightenment in a non-religious register.
Well, again, thank you so much for sharing that with us and also for being, a part of this series. I can't thank you enough, and
Glad
I
to do
wish
it.
you all the best.
Thank you, Chris.